Have you been sitting on a bunch of beats on your laptop or on your computer and you refuse to release them because you're not confident in how the overall mix and master sound like? Well, in this video, I'm gonna walk you through the mastering process and give you some insight into how I mix my songs. Last week, I started working on a lo-fi beat, and today I'm ready to mix it down and master it and send it over to Spotify and other streaming services. And I thought, why don't I record this process and give you some insight into my thought process when I'm ready to release a song. So the finished version of this track that we're gonna see at the end of this video is gonna be the actual song I'm gonna be submitting to Spotify and all the streaming services. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So as you can see, I have my project opened up, and each track in the playlist is a stem track. So that's the exported audio of each individual channel. So I have my guitar, my effects, my drum bus. This song contains various chopped up samples, some instruments that I played over it, but essentially this is what it sounds like. There's various ways you can get stems in here. You can record them in, you can export them from other software. So here on my left, you can see my MPC, and this is where I have the native instruments sample loaded up, which I used as the main melody to drive this track. And then I ended up chopping up that melody to sound like this. And then I basically exported the whole thing and I have it stemmed out in my FL Studio. So we're not going to go into too much detail in how I've balanced out the track. I do want to cover a few things just to highlight how we got to the final version of this mix. And then we can go into the mastering process. Since a lot of the stems contained chopped up samples, those samples contain various instruments that have a lot of information across the spectrum. So when you have all of that information in one mix down, you have to create space for them. So one of the things that I've done is you can see here in my guitar track, because that's the main thing, I'm going to solo it. Since this is the main melody that's driving it, I've sidechained this channel to two other channels that contain chopped up samples. And what I've done in those, so when they play together, I'm using a Neutron Unmask. So when the guitar is playing it, this purple line right here, that's my guitar. And you can see it's unmasking some of the clashing frequencies. So there's various ways of unmasking. I've created a video on how to unmask clashing frequencies. If you want to see that, I'll put a link above. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to focus specifically on the mastering portion of it. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But basically, I'm creating space for that guitar melody to stick out. So I do have it sidechained. I also added this brass melody that I played on top. So in that brass melody that I played on top, I wanted to make sure that it sticks above even the guitar melody. So I'm sidechaining the brass to the guitar, and you can see that as the guitar and the brass was playing, the frequencies were ducking down on the guitar because the brass was taking precedent above it. So again, this is some of the techniques that I use to create space in the mix, that if I want to bring your attention as you're listening to a certain instrument, I'm making sure that that instrument, the frequencies of that instrument take priority over anything else that might be in that mix. So altogether, it sounds like this. The other thing is, when you're using sample loops, you don't have control of the stereo image, right? So when you're using a sample, that sample could be very wide, it could be very narrow, like mono. So I slapped an imager on some of these to control. If I want certain frequencies to be wider, I can expand them. If I want them to be summed into mono, I can do that as well. So you can see here, all my frequencies below 207, I actually pulled them down in some of these samples. Also recovering some of the information that's on the side. So if the sample is too wide, I'm recovering some of that information and putting it down the middle. Lastly, you can see I've used Soothe on a bunch of these. So if I find that there's some resonant frequencies, if there's something that's a little bit piercing, whether it's in the low end, the high end, I like to use Soothe, and we're going to use that on the master as well. So how can we take this and have it mastered so we can submit it to Spotify? Let's work on that next. The first thing I do want to bring to your attention before we actually start adding plugins is I typically like all of my mix to come up to about -6 to -5, maximum -5 dB on the mix down channel or on the master channel. So you can see, watch when I'm going to play all of these. It's hitting about at -4.94, so 5 decibels. We don't want to go higher than that because we want to increase that loudness in our mastering process. So if you have things that are clipping, or if there's things that are like the peaks are really high, that's going to affect your overall mastering process. So you want to take care of that in the gain staging. You want to make sure that all of your instruments sum up nicely to about -6 or so dB for your final mix, not your master, but your final mix. So let's get into it. First thing I've added on the master channel is Ozone 10, and I've removed all of the default modules it adds. So let's see. The first thing I want to do is run this mix into an EQ if I need to boost or remove anything on the entire mix. So we've already done our individual track mixing. Now let's look at our final mix, see how it sits, see if we need to bump anything or remove anything. So let's take a look. Next, let's run it into a multi-band compressor. So let's use the Dynamics, and let's switch to the all section here because we want to see all of our bands. Right now it's just one band, but let's split it to 100. Next one around 600 or so. We'll fiddle, and then maybe 6,000. And let's take a listen. So down here you can see how much it's rolling off of each section. So my lows, mid lows, high mids, and then my highs, I can see underneath each one of these how much it rolls off. One of the things I like about the Dynamics module here is you can mix some of the dry and wet signal. So you're basically doing parallel compression. Let's saturate it using the Exciter. And oftentimes with the Exciter, I'll be honest, I like to see what they have in the presets, because sometimes I'll find a nice saturation preset that I like and work on it from there. So just so you know, when you're using the Exciter and you're adding saturation, you can use the type of saturation you want to add. It could be analog, retro, tape, tube, warm, triode, dual triode. And you can drive the saturation amount, but then bring down the mix to a very small percentage so that it's only subtly affecting it. So you could have the mix at 100% and you're only giving it a little bit of amount, or you can really drive that type of saturation and then just lightly mix it in. So that's what I'm just listening and making those adjustments. And you can listen to it. So here, see? Okay, let's add a dynamic EQ. And what we want to do here is actually pump it a bit when a threshold gets hit. I like to bump it a bit, see that? Again, if you're listening on a cell phone, you may not catch the subtleties there. On the mastering side, you don't want to change the sound. So I'm not trying to make EQ adjustments to change the sound. I'm trying to just bring some more presence to the overall mix. So subtle is better on the master than cranking certain things. So sometimes you'll listen and it's just such a subtle thing. If you don't know what you're listening for, you may actually miss it, but it makes the overall song sound better. So next I've added the Black Box saturator, the HG-2MS, because I want to do mid-side saturation. So instead of left and right, I do want to do mid-side. So down here you'll see an M/S, and I don't want the parameters to be linked. So I want to independently saturate the mids separately from the sides, and I'll solo it. Again, if you have headphones or if you're listening on proper speakers, you'll see the difference. So let me unlink those and let's do some saturation. So I'm basically using a low pass here and then controlling the saturation frequency around, let's low pass it around 900 and below. And let's take a listen to that. I also want to add this air here for that brightness. I absolutely love the Black Box. You can audibly hear the difference. It just sounds fuller. Yeah, it sounds better. So another EQ that I like to use is from Pulsar, which is the 8200. And I like to run it into mid-side on the master. And what I like to do on the sides is run a high-pass filter. I'm rolling off here at 110, and then you have this air band right here. So I can boost it up to maybe about 3 decibels. Then in the mids, we can bring up some of the mid information. So we can bump this up and we can move it to maybe about 2K. Let's take a listen. So as you can see in the sides, I rolled off past a certain frequency here, but I'm also using this low shelf to sort of bump a little bit before that roll off. And then in the mids, what I'm doing is I'm pulling some of that off and allowing it to go on the sides, but I'm bringing the sub frequencies down, and I can use a low shelf as well if I just want to make some of that low end rumble on the mids. So again, let's hear before and after. When I'm going to toggle this power button, we can listen before and after. Okay, it's good. Next, let's run it through Soothe just to clean up any resonant frequencies that may be present. So one of the things that I love doing in Soothe is if you want to hear what it's actually doing, click on Delta. So then that way you can listen where it's cleaning up and what it's cleaning up. So if I play it, just the default factory one, you can always sweep. Just make sure the bands are enabled. So you can always sweep where you want it to grab from. And then also what I love doing is running it in mid-side mode. So sometimes I'll have multiple instances of Soothe, and some of it I'll run in mid-side and only clean up the mids, certain frequencies. And then I'll also run it in side mode and clean up side frequencies. So I'll be honest, for me, Soothe has been a little bit underappreciated. I didn't use it too often at the beginning. I bought it. I kind of played around with it. Didn't find much use for it because I could listen in for those resonant frequencies. But man, the more I started using it, the more it just saves my time rather than me kind of sweeping through and trying to listen where there's any annoying resonance in my mix. I can just slap on Soothe, go on Delta, start listening what it's pulling out, and it's doing that for me. And it has some pretty good presets. Like one that I actually do use often is less mud on the master, at least as a starting point, right? So I can sweep around, and again, let's put Delta and see what it's doing. So you can see it's just, again, subtle changes, but it's pulling out some of those annoying frequencies that just may sound bothersome. Next, let's see if we need the God particle on this. I don't use the God particle on all my mixes, but let's see what the God particle is going to make this sound like. So I like to turn off everything first and then just bringing in one at a time just to see what it's actually doing. So let's play and let's take a listen. Leave it at 100, let it do its saturation magic and stereo width magic. But you know what, we should actually now add an imager just to make sure that we're not too wide and too much information is lost. So here you can see whatever's coming down the middle, you can see what's mono, and then everything that's on the side is the sides, again, the stereo image. And typically you want to be between 0 and +1 here. See that? That's what I said. I rolled off around there and made my signal mono, even though I still see I have a little bit of width there. I can just squeeze that down and make it really a mono signal. Typically, I like to also increase the sides. It just makes it sound brighter. If you take anything that's, I don't know, past 6,000, let's solo it. Just bump it up a bit. Not too much. I like to use the BX True Peak limiter. I like to put on the track at the end, even though I have other more transparent limiters. So I know some folks like their limiter to be transparent. I think it all depends on what kind of track you're mixing. For me, for a lo-fi track, you don't want it to sound the cleanest, because typically with lo-fi, because you're using a lot of jazzy samples and loops, you want it to sound almost like it's playing off of a record. That's why I ran it through a lot of the Exciter, which adds saturation, BX limiter, which I'm adding saturation. So again, each song is going to be mixed differently. What I'm trying to show you is, as you're listening to your song, one, you want it to have a certain loudness, a certain clarity, and a certain character. So the way I would mix for a lo-fi track is not the same way I would mix for like an R&B track or a pop song. It's not the same way I would mix for like an orchestral piece. But you have to listen to these things and know what you're trying to achieve. So I know that on the master, I like already how the mix is coming in. I'm just trying to dial in and add certain characteristics to the sound that gets it to sound polished. So with that being said, let's do a comparison before and after. So I have my metric AB. load it up, and now we can toggle back and forth between the unprocessed one. So this is just the mix without all of the plugins I'm using on the master, as well as what changes I've done. And let's take a listen. So we'll start off with B, which is the unprocessed one, and then we're going to toggle to A, which has all of our final mastering plugins. So let's take a listen. So you can see just how adding those plugins at the end of your mix, so your mastering chain, the difference that it can make. Typically, like I said, what I try to look for when I'm mastering the track is what character am I adding to it, how dynamic the track is, what's the overall balance of my mix. So each track is going to be different. An EDM track is going to be mixed differently than a lo-fi track. A lo-fi track, I wanted to have a lot of character. There's certain sound that a lo-fi track has that is not the most pristine, clean sound. It sounds more like a record being sampled and chopped up, and that's the character I'm looking to bring out of the track. Right? So if the samples that I'm using are clean, I need then to add that tape saturation and those little distortions that gives it a certain character without it sounding cheap and unbalanced or unmixed. So you can see the overall mix sits nicely, it sits balanced, but at the same time, there's a certain character it has. So hopefully you've learned something. Hopefully you've understood how the thought process behind mixing and mastering, how to balance your songs. And if you do have any questions, let me know in the comments. If you'd like to see me mix any other track, let me know. Again, this song is called Serenity, and as soon as it will hit the streaming services like Spotify, I will let you know in a video in the future. Hopefully you like to watch this process. Let me know what you think in the comments. And as always, I hope this inspired you to go and make some music. Peace.